Go.
Okay, my name is Paul Slater. When the war started, actually, I nominally was living in Brooklyn, but I was working out on Long Island in an agricultural school with a team of horses when we heard about Pearl Harbor. And now I live in Northampton, Massachusetts, and found that came here almost by accident. It's a great place to live, very great place. Where was I? It was on a Sunday afternoon. I was on an agricultural farm with a team of horses, and someone came running out and said the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and I told him in no uncertain words that I didn't believe him. And then I figured that somebody had been fiddling with the radio, because that's the kind of stuff we were doing in those days. But obviously they were right.
What were some of your thoughts?
After I believed it, I just had I could not comprehend why this would happen. You know, in retrospect, once I learned a few things about what was happening, paying a little more attention than most, you know, I was 17, it became quite clear what was happening and why.
At that moment, did you have any thought of serving in the military?
No, not right then, no.
Were you drafted or did you volunteer?
I volunteered. It sort of addresses both. I was, when I turned 18, I got a job in the Brooklyn Navy on a machine shop, classified as deferred from the draft as an essential civilian worker. And I did that for a few months, but the tenor of the times was such that it didn't make sense to me, and I enlisted in the Navy.
Why did you do that instead of waiting to be drafted?
Oh, well, because first of all, if I was going to go, I wanted to be in the Navy for several reasons. I had been fairly out to sea doing some heavy-duty fishing, and also my favorite uncle had been in the United States Navy in the First World War, so the Navy made sense, as much as it does at that age.
Describe the emotions of your family and friends on the home front after the U.S. entered the war. How was it different than before the war started?
Well, family and friends, okay, the family, the older people, they knew what it was like, what war could entail. They were upset, and they knew that their sons and nephews and so on were going to be, in one way or another, were going to be involved. And older guys than I was, the older brothers of some of my friends and high school people had volunteered to go to war in Spain to fight the fascist insurgency. So they knew there was war and it was deadly. But all of my friends, one was drafted. All the rest of us enlisted, and that was it.
What was boot camp like?
Boot camp was a mixed blessing, okay? Well, that is a nifty question. We were all children of the Depression. All of us had part-time jobs and so on. None of us were overweight even by an ounce. Nutrition was so poor that tens of thousands of young guys that were going to be drafted or wanted to volunteer couldn't even pass the physicals. And the first time, and this I learned, this question I wouldn't have been able to answer until I had been doing these kind of talks for a long time. But it's so self-evident. The first time we got to boot camp, it was at night. It was a terrible ride on a noisy choo-choo train. And we got there, and they sat us down, and they fed us. And for the first time in almost everyone's life, they could eat as much as they wanted. In the food was good. And one of my shipmates said to me a few years later, you know that, Slats? In boot camp, remember what they did to us? They made us run around and do all these things. He says, I gained 12 pounds in boot camp, okay? You know, and then they teach you other things, you know, certain skills, certain rope tying skills, which I ignored. I had no intention of doing that kind of stuff. And they taught you how to hate the enemy one way or another. And we learned our lesson. And it took a while to sort of unlearn it. It took a long time to unlearn it. I don't know, maybe this is relevant, it's sort of a slight segue, but some time ago at a reunion, we were all sitting around looking at people's photo albums. And one guy turned his over, and I saw a group of young POWs, German POWs who must have been shot down, given that this was in Tunis. And without even thinking, I blurted out, for Pete's sake, we were killing kids. And my friend put his hand on me, he says, well, Slats, we were all kids then. But when that was going on, you never thought in those terms. Oh yeah, well, we shot down 3 planes, you know. Well, a few years later, you stop to think about it, you killed 12 people. And that's the kind of orientation, that kind of education you get in boot camp, and that's why wars sunk right in the start, just in case you're wondering. Yes?
What are some of the memories of going to war after training? What was it like? Was it what you expected?
Well, yeah, I had no great expectations, so, but yeah, it was. I mean, I got the kind of a ship that I wanted to be on and so on. And, I mean, one of the things that I remember, one of the many things, fortunately, the first time we set out to sea, you know, with a convoy and officially as one of the escorts guarding these convoys of merchantmen. We were the destroyer escorts to protect them from the U-boats, the German submarines. And when we got out to sea the very first time, as soon as we were really out to sea, where we couldn't communicate back home, the skipper got on the thing, and we hear, now hear this, men, now that we're out to sea, I can tell you where we're going. We're going to Casablanca, okay? And Casablanca, the movie, had just come out. We had all seen it. Everybody, yay, we're going to Casablanca. Not one of us thought that, you know, they're going to be trying to kill us on the way, and when we get there, no, we're going to go to Casablanca. Yeah, well, we did, of course. But, so that's the, you know, when, you know, 18, 19 years old, those are how you mind. In those days, I'm not trying to decide what everybody else does today. That's the way we react to that kind of stuff. And, you know, there were terrible times, and there was one terrible storm in which several ships went down, a few hundred casualties, and we weathered that storm. And I knew that in spite of how terrible it was, and it was wicked, I knew that my ship, she was special and she was going to be fine. And so I assumed that, and she was. And that's the way it goes. You know, that's the kind of thing I guess that helps you sort of survive as stuff is going on. Is that a reasonable response?
Did you serve in Pacific or Atlantic Theater?
I'm sorry?
Did you serve in the Pacific or Atlantic Theater?
Atlantic. Well, the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean.
Where were the main locations of the region you served?
land locations?
Yeah.
Okay, well, mostly we picked up, obviously, we picked up our convoys else someplace in the States all the time. And we would go, typically, I mean, we did 19 convoys, but typically, we'd go to Gibraltar, and, and right at the beginning, we went to Morocco, Casablanca, which is in the Atlantic. But after that, we began taking convoys into the Mediterranean, and that was very dangerous because the enemy really wanted to squelch it because they were still fighting in Africa. And if we could disrupt their communication, their ship communications, to supply the General Rommel who was heading it, it would squelch their effort. In fact, though, it did make it very hard, and the Germans had to leave. But we stopped in such places as Gibraltar, Algiers, Oran, North Africa, Tunis, probably something else doesn't come to mind, but it was almost always the North African coast. And that's the only seas that we were in were the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean.
What was your job or assignment? Describe a typical day for you on duty.
Okay, that's the operative thing on duty, because if not, I was asleep, I hope. I was in the engineering division, and my responsibility were the main engines. We had, our ship was a diesel-electric ship, huge diesel engines driving generators which energized motors which drove the shaft. We had two shafts, two propellers, two shafts, very well designed little ship. And also I was the senior first class petty officer, and it was my job to mentor younger guys who were coming up with to this rank, and you had to teach them what their duties would be, how the machinery was to be maintained, how to operate it, how to read the manuals, and some, in a rare case, the blueprints. And it sounds sort of simple, but that was it. And of course you'd get calls from the Radio Shack. They would want to know the injection temperature. They wanted to know the temperature of the seawater that was coming in to cool your engines, because they needed to know that temperature to decipher their sonar responses, because the temperature and the density of the water made a difference. And so they knew that. And of course, you had to, if you were, we could mainly cruise on just one engine in each engine room. But the engine or engines that were running all had in each cylinder, they were huge 16-cylinder engines, quite a bit further than that camera. And each one had a thermocouple, a little device that turned the temperature into an electrical charge, and it told you the temperature of each cylinder, and you had to log that, you had to write that down regularly. Everything, you just didn't sit there and listen to the engine run, basically. And that was 4 on and 8 off. Another 4 hours you worked on maintenance and so on. And and if you could get a chance, to flake out, go to sleep someplace, you did, because you could be up lots of times on the general quarters, much of which would be in vain, but you had to be ready. And you would, so you took it easy when you could. One of my cousin's destroyers came in when my ship was in, and he was asking for me, They said, you know, you'll find slats in the number one motor room on the upper deck on the starboard side. He'll be sleeping there with his head on his foul weather jacket. And sure, that's where it was. So you took your rest when you could get it.
Describe one or a few of the most memorable events or things that happened during the war.
I think well, okay, one is a wartime thing. I sort of dwell on that. We were under attack, and for some reason, my ship was assigned to what they called the coffin corner, and this is where typically the enemy aircraft will try to break into the convoy. And we were given that spot for one of two reasons, which you can choose to believe. Half of us said we were the least valuable ship, so they put us there, and we would absorb all the trouble, and then the rest could cope. The other group, my group, said we're the best of the lot, and that's why we're there. And that was true. In fact, someplace there's a commendation about this which says that we contributed substantially to that victory. But I think one sort of an exciting development, we were attacked by 3 torpedo planes. They really wanted to nail this one ship. 3 of them got torpedoes off. They were all coming toward us, and we had to maneuver, a very maneuverable ship, very well designed. We had to maneuver in certain position that we essentially, what we did was comb their wakes. We went in a certain position where 2 of them passed us on one side, another one passed on the other side. So that was probably one of the closest calls that we ever had. Close enough.
Were you ever injured or wounded while serving?
Not that it counted. One time we were starting a depth charge run, and either they were set too shallow or we hadn't gotten up to speed because the ship itself got jolted. And it jolted a steam line which burned me pretty bad. Well, not too bad, because when I went to sick bay later, he says, well, it was 100 degrees steam, so that's 330 some odd degrees, so your wound is sterile, isn't it? You know, that was the encouraging thing. Turns out that could have been a Purple Heart, but at the time we sort of discounted it because it wasn't caused by the enemy per se.
How long were you on duty overseas, and when and how did you come home?
Well, I was on duty almost 3 years, but you're not at sea all the time, obviously. You come back to the real world for repairs, pick up a convoy, so on. And I was on, the war had ended in Germany, and I was on the West Coast, and the war ended. And then it was just a matter of each person had been collecting what they called points. How much time you served, how many battles, how many, whatever, you know. And how many you grow toenails, I'm not sure. But when you had enough, they could give you if you lived on the East Coast, they gave you a ticket, and off you went. And you can't, there was another sort of a close call, okay. This was after the war. I was in charge of a small group of guys in San Diego on a train. We got off the train. They told us the train's not leaving for X number of hours. So we went ashore. We got stuff to eat, did a good thing. Got back. The train is pulling out of the station. Okay, it has our sea bag, it has everything in it. So we're desperate. We start to hitchhike. A guy comes up in a Buick, which at that time was the kind of car. He told him what happened. He said, I'll catch that train. And we roared through the countryside, through walnut orchards and some kind of citrus stuff. He was driving like crazy, and I was thinking, geez, we survived the war and we're going to die on a road someplace in California. But he got there just as that train was pulling in. I was full of goose pimples. I think we were as close to dying then as any other time. So, you know, and that was after the war. But we made it, obviously.
What was it like coming home? Was it like easy to just like?
No, not really. I thought it was easy. I thought it was going to be easy, but after a while, you realize that things have changed very substantially. But some of the stuff that happened was positive. You know, they had the GI Bill. They had a program where for a year they paid you $20 a month or something while you were looking for work. Those who wanted to try to get to school were helped with that. Anybody got it? Oh, how we're going home and home. Even getting home was so they made it as convenient as possible to sort of get into the swing of things. And but even on the way home, we were working our way east, and we were in Chicago, hoping to get a train back to the East Coast. And so I asked the guard here.
Following students, please come to the office. Alyssa and Elena Montez, please come to the office.
I told him, geez, I and my two guys that I'm escorting, said, where's the next train to the East Coast? Oh, he says, geez, it's right downstairs, and it's going to be leaving any minute. He said, what you want to really do is run down this up escalator as fast as you can, and you can get on that train, and I'll let them know. How he let them know, I don't have a clue. I'm sure he didn't have a cell phone. But we waited. There was a conductor down there who took us on, and we made it in 17 hours, which was sort of a record at that time, from Chicago to New York City. And so in every respect, they try to help us. Which is far better than the Vietnam veterans experience, I guarantee you.
What were some valuable things, like lessons, skills or lessons you believe you learned during your time in the military, serving in wartime?
Well, I learned to be sort of patient, but it didn't stick. But I think what some of my shipmates learned, and I discussed this earlier, when we were growing up, my friends and I, each part of our city was divided up into different villages, so whatever else you want to call it, different ethnic and religious groups and so on. And in some of them, there was hostility to some of the others. And once we were on board, and we were a mix of kids from all over the country, you know. I mean, different. We were all white, but other than that, the different ethnic groups, different religions, different cultural stuff. You know, if some of the guy from Texas was very different from the kid from Minnesota or from Brooklyn or whatever. And we all sort of learned that we're all in this together, and by God, we better back one another up or we're in trouble. And we did. You know, there was one engineering officer who most of us despised, and we called him Stinky, but he did a good job, and his name was either Jewish or German, Some of us assumed one or the other or both, but nobody cared. He did what he had to do. His personality was not important. And nobody cared. One of my close friends was, first generation German kid. And in fact, we once had a conversation about how come when they attacked us that time, they didn't strafe the ship. And he says, I got up on a forecastle and I said, Nick Schiessen, don't shoot, my name is Schmidt. That was not terribly funny, especially when told to his grandfather who had fought for the Kaiser in the First World War. But everybody was in it together. There was just no, and I learned, if nothing else, that other people can learn to get together. An important lesson. And I also learned to control myself. It took a while. This sort of answers something else. Some while later, we moved into a house, my kids were little, and I was describing how this house is really built well. You see, these are not sheetrock, these are real plaster walls, da-da-da-da. My son says, let's see you punch a hole in that wall, Dad. Then I realized that the war is over and you better cool it. Because if your kid thinks you could do that, he might feel threatened also. So I did. It became sort of civilized.
Did you join any veterans organizations like the Veterans Before the War?
No, I joined the American Veterans Committee, which was sort of I guess, a aggressive group. And, they backed people like Truman. They weren't way out there anyways. And one of the veterans groups was really, I don't know what they did anymore, but I have yet to forgive them. I do bear grudges. I don't know why.
Illustrations that appeared in the, what's the local free paper?
The Advocate?
Advocate.
The Valley Advocate.
So those are drawings that I did.
Get started.
My name is Tom Lehman, and I live in Whately, Massachusetts, which is a little village up to the north. And I'm going to talk about being an infantry soldier in World War II. And I'm an artist, and these are some of the things that I've been doing. You don't have to memorize them, just check them out.
I know, right? This is
Wow.
amazing.
You have a lot of skill.
Thank
I'll tell
you.
you that. You're welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad I came to
It's
this meeting.
amazing.
Okay, first question.
I can start off.
Are we starting at the beginning or starting when we got?
No, start at the beginning.
I'll start. Do you remember where you were and what you were doing when Pearl Harbor was bombed?
Now, I have to say one other thing of introduction, and that is, if you'll look at me carefully, you'll notice I have hearing aids,
Okay.
which means I don't hear very well.
Okay.
So if you could manage to shout, that
Okay.
would be helpful.
All right. All right. Let me re-ask the question.
Yeah.
Do you remember where you were and what you were doing when Pearl Harbor was bombed?
Yeah, I was in high school, and I think I was, at that time, I was a junior. And of course, we were all horrified and wondering what was going to happen next.
What were some of your thoughts?
Excuse me?
What were some of your thoughts?
What were my main thoughts?
Yeah.
Well, I felt in danger. I felt that we were being, that our nation was being attacked, by a very dangerous enemy, not a democracy, but a very militaristic group. And what did this mean for us? I mean, are there going to be more attacks? Are they going to be in our end of the nation, or is it going to stay in California and the Hawaiian Islands?
At that moment, did you have any thoughts about serving in the military?
Yes. My parents were very much opposed to it because they were very pacifist, and they didn't want their dear boy to be endangered. That's me. And but all my friends were being drafted, going into the Navy or the Army, and I wanted to be a part of it. I was very much opposed to the enemies we would be fighting. I did not want them to have influence in the world to which I was a citizen. So I never had any doubts about the rightness of my being in the armed services.
Nice.
Were you drafted or did you volunteer?
Drafted. I probably would have volunteered if I hadn't been drafted. All my friends were going into services.
Describe the emotions of your family and friends on the home front after the U.S. entered the war. How is it different than before the war started?
Would you run through that again with a slightly louder volume?
Loud.
I know. I do.
She's wearing.
Describe the emotions of your family and friends on the home front after the U.S. entered the war. How was it different than before the war started?
Oh, just totally different. My parents were, it was like, oh, we're giving this boy to be slaughtered when I was drafted. We're losing him. Whatever will happen to him? This is a little bit of a cartoon, but there was a lot of that feeling. And my mother cried when I went to the draft board and got on the train to go to training. So they were afraid that their dear boy was going to be in mortal danger and might never come back. Because we had neighbors to whom this happened, you know. Yeah.
What was boot camp like? What was boot camp like?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
What was boot camp like?
What was my camp like?
Boot camp.
Boot camp. Did you go to boot camp?
Yeah, it was called basic training. Army boot camp was basic training. And I was glad to be there, frankly, because practically every guy I knew all my friends were in one service or the other, and I felt very opposed to the people we were in combat with, the Nazis and the Imperial Japanese. I just felt these were people that needed to be put down so we could have democracy around the world. And so I had no doubts about taking an actual part in this thing. But the funny thing is, funny to me, is that instead of I went into basic training, which is how you learn to be a fighting infantryman. And then we took a written test, and quite a few of us were sent to college, to Brooklyn College, to learn to be clerks in the historical divisions of the services. And that lasted for 3 months. We were in New York City. We were in Brooklyn. We got onto the subway. We go into New York City, and a lot of times we go to the movies. were in the Army. And we go to the movies, or we go to a shooting gallery and pay 25 cents and shoot at moving ducks. Great way to be in the Army. So we did that for 3 months, and then the Nazis in Germany and the Japanese showed unusual amounts of strength. And so they wiped out our whole program and put everybody into the infantry, which means the gun-carrying soldiers. So we had infantry training, and then we were shipped overseas.
What were your memories of going to war after?
Brandon.
What were your memories of going first to war after training? And was it what you expected it to be?
Oh, boy. What would you expect war to be? Combat. I was excited, and I was scared, and I felt useful, because I felt we should be fighting this war. And all my friends were doing it. I had lots of friends in the training group where we were, my fellow soldiers. And I mean, people were shooting at me. People were sending shells over, and they were exploding in my neighborhood. And who wouldn't be scared?
Yeah.
And the other thing is, our division went into combat shortly after New Year's in 1945, and this was the worst winter in 70 years, I think they said, in Europe, where we were. So we marched into combat in snow, and we were not really equipped for this. We all had galoshes, like Grandma had us wear, you know? And so we had to dig our foxholes in frozen earth, in the woods, in the forests, in Belgium, the Battle of the Bulge. Okay? I quit. Next.
Did you serve in the Pacific or Atlantic Theater?
Very much the Atlantic. Europe.
Where were the main locations of regions in which you served?
I trained in England, in Wales, where right just a few miles from where my grandmother and grandfather were born. And that was quite a thrill. And we trained in Wales, and then we were shipped over into Belgium, and we went into combat in Belgium.
What was your job assignment? Describe a typical day for you on duty.
Would you say that again? I'm an old fella with bad hearing.
Don't worry about it.
What was your job assignment, and what was a typical day on duty?
Okay. I was an assistant gunner in a 60 millimeter mortar squad. There were about 5 guys in the squad. A mortar is a hollow tube about this long and on a tripod like a camera, and you take shells, you pull off the fuse, and you drop the shell into the mortar, and then the shells go up and hopefully into the enemy's foxhole. So that's what was my job. It was my job to make the shells available and hand them to the gunner.
Describe one or few of the most memorable events or things that happened during the war.
Describe a few memorable events that happened in the war.
Thanks, pal.
Thank you, Brandon.
See me for a support check afterwards. Well, I think one thing was feeling like I was doing what I should be doing. I felt in spite of the great danger, I felt that these people need to be, Hitler, the Nazis, needed to be put down. They'd done so much evil in the world. And I was proud to be a part of that. And pretty much, I liked the guys I was with. Very few women in the Army in those days, sorry to say. I apologize on behalf of the government.
Were you injured on the job or wounded?
I was hit a couple of times by little pieces of shrapnel, which is a piece of metal from an exploding shell. And it was Band-Aid stuff. But the real damage was that our Army had not expected to fight a battle during the winter. So our equipment was very inadequate. We wore galoshes instead of winter boots and several pairs of socks. And so a lot of people suffered from frost damage, and I was one of them. After a little more than a month in combat, in the worst winter in 50 years in Europe, I could no longer use my hands, and I was crippled. I couldn't walk. So I went into the hospital and had several operations correcting my frozen feet. Poor boy. Next.
How long were you on duty overseas, and how did you come home?
I think I was overseas from before Thanksgiving until just before Valentine's Day. So what'd that be? 4 months, 3 months?
About that.
Yeah. So, a short time, but very active. Is that okay for the question? Okay.
What was it like coming home? Was it easy to adjust to life?
What was it like coming home and?
How was it? Was it easy to adjust to life?
Well, I came home, you mean to my house
Home to back,
or United States?
United States.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was very strange coming back to the United States because there'd been no bomb damage in the United States. And of course, there were everybody was at work in defense industries. But there were a lot of civilians walking around, of course, a lot of people in uniform too. And I was I came home on a hospital ship that was crowded. They had bunks, like 5 in a row, each one with a wounded guy in it. And this whole ship was filled with people like this. We all went to different hospitals. I was anxious about what was my fate in the hospital, what would it be like. And, but it was wonderful to be back. And it was very interesting to see the differences in the United States from when I left, even though I've been out for quite a relatively short time.
What are some valuable things, skills, or lessons that you learned during the war?
Ooh. Valuable lessons that I learned during the war. Well, I was very glad that I was fighting with a democratic force to put down Hitler and the Nazis. I was very proud of that. Because that's not the way of life that is good for human race. It's very interesting getting acquainted. Of course, I was brought up a Yankee, New Englander, And it was very interesting getting acquainted with people from, other guys from all around the country. I mean, some of those guys from down there, Joe, you just didn't talk like I did. It took me a little while to find out what they were saying. But it was, I wouldn't have, it was a good experience. You know. Next.
Did you join any veterans organizations like the Veterans of Foreign Wars?
Well, I was in the 75th Infantry Division, and I joined their national organization. We'd have a national reunion every summer for several years. I did not join any of the other groups. Why? I'm not sure.
What did you do after the war for a job?
I became a student. I like to think of myself as an artist, and so I went to art school at the Rhode Island School of Design, and then started looking for jobs where somebody would say, "Oh, we like the kind of artwork you do. Would you do a drawing for us?"
Did you stay in touch with any of the troops you served with after you returned, or attended any reunions?
Yeah, definitely. For many years, I would go to 75th Division reunions. And for many years, we would, the guys I knew in my youth outfit would exchange letters, and always Christmas cards, because that's when we were in combat. So bit by bit, they died, and I haven't yet, and not thinking of it, but as we get older, we go our separate ways, so we don't see much of it, but we did keep very much in touch by correspondence, phone calls, and these annual reunions in different cities across the United States.
This one's long. There is a lot on the news about the emotional wound of PTSD and how it has affected troops coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. If you feel comfortable telling us, will you or any other military personnel you know who served in the WWII
World War
World War II. WWII. Affected by PTSD, and what are a few ways it affected you?
I'm sorry, you asked that question. I'm just fooling. I think everybody who has been in combat is affected by it. I still have dreams occasionally about, quite frequently, particularly if I'm cold at night. My brain, not me, my brain puts me back in the foxholes. I have vivid images of being frozen, nearly frozen to death in that winter foxhole. Not infrequently. So, but as far as, getting out my BB gun and taking a shot at anybody with a German name, I don't do it. Does that answer the question?
Yes.
Okay.
Very much so.
What are some? What are some of the ways veterans can cope with and heal emotional wounds like PTSD?
That's a very good question. And I think I've answered some of it, that the images of being in combat when you were in a teenage don't go away. They impress yourself into your head. So they continue. I don't think I've had memory. You know, I don't dodge every time or duck under the table every time I meet somebody with a German name. That's about all I'd say.
Have you ever been to the World War II Memorial in Washington or any other World War II memorials?
Yeah, I've been to several of them. I've never been to the one in Washington, but I'm a member, so I get all their propaganda and their appeals for funds. But I have never happened to be there myself. I have one of my paintings of a World War I German flyer is in the Air and Space Museum in Washington. But I have never been there, nor to the institution you refer to.
What was it like to going to those memorials?
Well, if I haven't been there, how can I answer that?
Well, the ones that you went to.
Well, being an artist, I'm always interested in museums and memorials. And I feel that a wartime memorial doesn't really pay attention to what we combat soldiers have been through. So kind of a yin-yang, plus minus. Yeah.
Well, thank you for participating with us and spending time with us today.
Thank you.
We all appreciate it.
Well, you are a most attentive, attractive, and good questioning group.
Thank you.
And I feel flattered that you would have me sitting in this chair and showing you my artwork.
It's very nice.
Thank you.
So, were you drafted or did you volunteer? And if you volunteered, why did you do that instead of waiting to be drafted?
I volunteered, and the reason I volunteered was because I'd done high school and then 1 year of college, and I was sick of it. I know that all of you adore school and wish you could be in school all summer long, but I was thinking that school was not connected with real life. And I'd played varsity sports in high school, and I'd gone mountain climbing and loved doing adventures, and somehow out there was real life, and it wasn't in school. So the college I was going to said I could be gone for 2 years, and the Marine Corps offered me a 2-year enlistment, so I went off to have some adventure, I thought,
That's nice.
and I enlisted.
Wish I could do that, honestly, because honestly, school is wonderful. I love having my friends, family nearby, but I do want to go see stuff, like go to different countries and, just explore a little outside of Westfield.
So you know that feeling that can
Yes.
drive you, yeah. There was a book way back then called On the Road, written by a guy named Jack Kerouac, and that was sort of my Bible at the time, because he just said, goodbye everything, I'm going to hit the road and just go have adventures. So I thought that's what was going to happen in the Marine Corps.
That's my plan. Hopefully I can find a way to do that.
Great. Mackenzie.
Yes.
All right.
What was
Sam?
Shane,
Shane. Shane. That's a cool name. I love the name Shane. Yeah.
what was boot camp like?
What was boot camp like? Well, let me tell you what happened in the first 5 minutes I got to boot camp. I was on a bus with 50 other guys, and it was a hot July night. And the bus arrived at boot camp at midnight, and there was a sign over the door to the building. And the sign said, "Through these portals pass recruits for the greatest fighting machine in the world." And I thought, oh, cool. So out of the door to the building came the drill instructor. And he looked just like you'd think the drill instructors are like in the movies. He was like 20 feet tall and shoulders 12 feet wide, and he had sort of a Gold's Gym body, and he had that Smokey the Bear hat, you know, that tilted down over his eyes. And he got on the bus and he said, "Welcome to Parris Island. If you are chewing gum, you will swallow it. If you are smoking the cigarette, you will extinguish it. You got 3 seconds to get off this bus, and 2 of them are up. Now move." And then he got off the bus. So we all ran off the bus, and there were little yellow footprints, and we put our feet in the yellow footprints. And then out of nowhere, 4 or 5 other drill instructors appeared, screaming and yelling, and one of them got his nose like a ½ inch from mine and started screaming at me, and he had a chaw of...
Sorry to interrupt, Joe. Laura Sears in my room. She's too nervous to come. She must just...
And he had a chaw of tobacco in his mouth. So when he was screaming at me, all of this tobacco just hit my face and trickled down my cheeks, and I didn't move at all, because they'd already somehow let me know that Jim Monroe had to go away to be replaced by Recruit Monroe, who would do anything that they told him to do. So that was my first 5 minutes on the boot camp. And after that, we were there 7 weeks in boot camp. It used to be 13 weeks, but so many guys were getting killed in Vietnam that they shortened it up. And so, I mean, I could talk to you a lot more about boot camp, all sorts of stories, but that was basically it.
What were your memories arriving in Vietnam? Was it what you had expected?
When I arrived in Vietnam? I arrived by plane at night, pouring rain, and I didn't know what was going on. I was feeling confused, I was feeling sort of lost and lonely, and people were sort of saying, "Go there and sit here." And even though it had all sorts of training to get ready for it, still when I actually got there, it was bizarre. We spent the first night in a building that looked like a normal building, but it had sandbags around it. So I didn't know whether to be afraid or not. Because on the one hand, everything looked normal, like back in the States, but on the other hand, it was in a war. So it was sort of a mixture. And I was stationed with a unit that had been fighting, but when I got there, nothing was going on. So that was my first impression.
How long was the plane ride from here to Vietnam?
Well, first of all, I flew from here to Okinawa. And that was, we left from California. We stopped in Hawaii for a little bit, but it was like maybe 10 or 12 hours. And then from Okinawa, after I was there for a week, and after I saw the same Walt Disney movie about 10 times, we flew down to Vietnam. It was about a 2-hour flight. Yeah. Great. Rebecca.
Where were you stationed?
So I was stationed right outside the city of Da Nang. See, back during the war, there was South Vietnam and North Vietnam. Today it's all one country, the Republic of Vietnam. But when I was there, South Vietnam was connected with the United States, and North Vietnam was connected with China. And in South Vietnam, there were 2 main cities, Saigon and Da Nang. Those were the 2 cities. Saigon was in the south where the Army was. Da Nang was in the north where the Marine Corps was. I was in the Marine Corps. So it's just outside the city of Da Nang. Sort of not out in the country, but not in the city. Stationed with an artillery.
What was your job
Tell me your name.
Madison.
Madison.
What was your job or assignment? Describe a typical day for you on duty.
Okay. I was in with a unit in a kind of a built-up area. It was a hill about a ½ mile long, not very high, and all around it was barbed wire and foxholes. But I never, there was no enemy activity outside the barbed wire. There were fields, rice paddies, and villages. But inside our unit, there were lots of buildings. and I was sleeping in something called a hooch. And a hooch was a little wooden building with a tin roof, and it slept about 10 guys on canvas cots. And we would have mosquito netting over our cots. It was not for mosquitoes, but there were rats there, and it would keep the rats from running over you. And I worked 6 hours on, and then 12 hours off around the clock in an underground bunker at a computer. And so here's what I did. Let's say that Mackenzie is out in the field somewhere, 10 miles away from me in my bunker, and she sees some North Vietnamese soldiers. So she calls me up on the telephone, and she gives me the map coordinates of where those North Vietnamese soldiers are. So I sit at my computer. This is 1969, so it's only got about 6 buttons, but still, it's a computer. And I take the map coordinates, and I change them around and come up with some numbers. Then I get on the telephone, and I call up Rebecca. And she's 10 miles that way, and she's in charge of a howitzer. And a howitzer is a cannon with a great big huge long barrel, and the howitzer would shoot shells that were like this big, great big shells. And I would give Rebecca numbers that the howitzer could understand for aiming. So then she would shoot one shell, and it would go up and up and up and over and land over here. And Mackenzie would call me up and say, okay, I saw where that shell landed. It's got to go 100 yards that direction and 50 yards this way in order to land in the middle of the North Vietnamese soldiers. So she'd give me slightly different map coordinates. Change them around, call up Rebecca. She'd change the aim a little bit. She'd fire another shell. This time the shell would land in the middle of the North Vietnamese soldiers. Mackenzie would call me up and she would say, fire for effect. I'd call up Rebecca, I'd say fire for effect, and then Rebecca would fire a whole bunch of shells. So that's what I did. And you see the dynamic there? I never saw or heard anything happening over there. I never saw bodies being blown apart over there. And I never heard or saw anything over where Rebecca was, 10 miles that way, with the howitzer. So I was helping to cause, really awful things to happen, but I didn't experience it. There was a cartoon. Have you ever read Doonesbury cartoons? No? Well, there was a Doonesbury cartoon during the Vietnam War. And in the cartoon it showed 2 pilots in a big B-52 bomber. They dropped huge 500-pound bombs. And in the cartoon, one of the pilots is saying to the other, hey, did you hear? The Knicks won by 2 last night. And the point is, these 2 pilots are talking about a basketball game back in the United States, and they're not having any experience of what the bombs that they're dropping are actually doing on the ground in terms of just unbelievable devastation. Well, that's what it was for me until one special night. So that's what I did in Vietnam. See, that was Madison. Tell me your name. Ariana.
During the war, there were many peace and anti-war protests at home. Did you know they were happening, and what did you think about them?
Yeah, that's another great question. When I was in Vietnam, I didn't really know a lot about the protests going on. When I joined the Marine Corps in 1967, there was some protests, but it was early-ish days and still a lot of support for the war. And then when I came back and went back to college in the fall of 1969, that's when the protests were really getting going. 69, 70, and especially 71, they were huge. So, not while I was in Vietnam, it was when I came back that it really got going for me, the protests. Good question, Ariana. Hey.
I am Laura.
And tell me your name.
Laura.
Laura, great.
Describe one or a few of the most memorable events or things that happened while you were in Vietnam.
Okay. Well, I see what the next question is, so I'm going to hold off on talking about when I was wounded. Other memorable events. Well, one day an American film crew came, a news, who was doing news, and they wanted to see some action. So they had us get all dressed up in our combat gear and go out into the rice paddy and wade through the rice paddy pretending that we were fighting. And it was just, I mean, it was stupid. And we all had great fun doing it. It was just ridiculous. So that's one thing I remember. Another thing I remember, I want to say this delicately, but where in Vietnam and where we were stationed, they didn't have like regular toilets with, you know, pipes and, you know, all the normal sanitation we think of. You know, there'd just be a little tiny thing that you'd go into, and when you went to the bathroom, everything collected in a huge barrel underneath. And so one of the jobs you had to do was to take that barrel out and burn it. I cannot describe for you what the smell was like when you burned that. But anybody who's ever been in a combat zone would immediately identify that smell. So that's a little something that I remember from Vietnam. Another thing I remember, Laura, is that right beside the hooch where I was sleeping, there was a landing pad for helicopters. And anybody who ever fought in Vietnam, they will say the #1 sound that reminds them of Vietnam is the sound of helicopters. And to this day, when I hear a helicopter, I instantly think of Vietnam, because where I lived all day long, helicopters were landing and taking off. I remember one day getting on a truck and going into Da Nang, which is a seaport, and seeing a ship blown in half of it on one side of the road and one half on the other. And I don't know when it had happened, you know, sometime earlier, but that was just sort of stunning to me to see that. And then I remember going to a beach. We drove by a beach called the China Beach, and it was beautiful with a big sign saying posted, no trespassing on the beach. So it was sort of tantalizing there it was, and you couldn't go. So, as I was saying to Matt, there was this experience of, on the one hand, I'm in a war zone. You know, this is a war going on, and yet life was sort of normal. Sort of any fighting was happening somewhere else. I have some friends who went to Vietnam and instantly got into combat situations, but for me, for a while, it was just kind of sort of, well, where's the war?
Well, I know you already saw the question, but were you injured on the job or wounded?
I was. And I'm really here to be with you because what happened to me in the early morning hours of February 23, 1969, completely changed my life. February 23, 1969 is when the war, for me, stopped being an adventure and exciting and became something very different. And in a way, my entire life has been affected by sort of what happened to me. When I come speak to you 8th graders in a couple of weeks, I'll tell that story in detail. But briefly, I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning, sleeping in a hooch, and heard explosions. And I ran outside and I got into a foxhole, and after a while, there was an explosion in the foxhole, and a North Vietnamese soldier had thrown a grenade into the foxhole, which exploded. And I don't have any words to describe what it's like to have an explosion like that happen right next to you. I mean, I literally cannot think of words that would make you really fully be able to understand how huge the force was, what it felt like to have that force go through me, through my physical body, through my spirit, and to experience sort of the awfulness of it. It was so loud I didn't actually hear it physically, and it was so painful that I didn't physically feel any pain. It was bigger than that. Years later, the image that came to me was of a naked little baby lying on a beach with a tidal wave coming toward that baby. And the baby can't run away, the baby can't hide, the baby can't escape. All the baby can do is just lie there, and that wave can do anything with it that it wants to. And that was, I mean, years later I sort of learned this language to try to describe what it was like to have that explosion. And again, I'll make it much longer during the presentation, but a about 20 minutes, there was one other guy in the foxhole with me. And about 20 minutes later, I think, there was a second explosion. I had stood up to try to help this guy because he'd been wounded by the first grenade. And I saw something floating out of the corner of my eye just for a second, and then it exploded. And that was the second grenade. And the second grenade killed the man who was right beside me, which I didn't know at the time. All I knew was that, again, this unbelievable force overwhelmed me. So I lay down in the foxhole and eventually got out of the foxhole. And again, there's a long story to that, and ended up in a hospital in Da Nang. So I'll say a little bit more having to do with that. So I was in the hospital in Da Nang for about a week, 10 days. And then I went to a hospital in Japan for about 2 weeks, and then a hospital in Boston for a couple of months. And then when that was all done, my time in the Marine Corps was about out anyway. So I got out of the Marine Corps and then went back to college, thinking, well, that takes care of that. That's over. And not knowing that the effect of that experience would take years and years and years of working. Because there were some after effects of it, and that might be another question for what it was like when I came back.
Yeah, I think it is.
Okay.
Yeah, it is.
Thanks. Jane?
Wait, did you just answer about how long were you in Vietnam? How did you come home?
No.
How long were you in Vietnam, and how did you come home?
Aha, okay, great. Well, so I was only in Vietnam 2 months, and then I got blown up. So I came home on a stretcher. I left Japan and put me in a stretcher, and they flew me. Remember, we stopped in Alaska to refuel, and then landed in Boston, and then went to Chelsea Naval Hospital, which doesn't exist anymore, but it was in Chelsea, in Boston. So that's why I came home.
What was it like to come home? Was it easy to adjust to life?
Vietnam, people increasingly thought it was a terrible war, and so when soldiers and Marines came home from Vietnam, they were not treated very well. They weren't welcomed home. It's very different for folk coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, who were welcomed home and thanked. I personally was ignored. People would see me and say, "Oh, you've been gone? Okay," and that was it. Nobody really expressed much interest in wanting to know what had happened to me. Other people, I mean, there's stories of soldiers being spat upon, called baby killers, and a lot of my friends I know refused to ever wear their uniforms when they got home. They took it off instantly. Even when they landed at the airport, they go straight to the men's room and change into civilian clothes because nobody was thanking soldiers for being involved in the Vietnam War. So on one level, I instantly adjusted. I just went back to college, so that takes care of that. But on another level, it was very different. Let me ask, do you all know the initials PTSD? Yeah, post-traumatic stress disorder.
That's a question.
Was that coming up?
Yeah.
It's the really.
Oh, okay. All right. Then I'm going to save it. I'll save it till we get there. So adjusting to life on one level was fine. Another level was really, really hard. But I'll save it for the next question when we get there. Rebecca.
Did you join any veterans organizations like Veterans of Foreign Wars? Why or why not?
No, I didn't. I don't get asked that question very often, and it's a really good one. In World War II, soldiers tended to sign up, and then they would train in basic training with the group, and then they would stay with that group, and they go to some advanced training, and then the group would stay together as they traveled, maybe by boat, either to the Pacific or over to Europe, and then when they'd arrive, and then they would fight together, and then they'd finish fighting, and they'd all come home together. So it tended to be in World War II that you made really, really, really close friends. I don't know if any of you ever saw Band of Brothers, but it was about World War II and about how the soldiers really connected with each other. So when they came back, it was natural for them to find ways to stay together. So World War II clubs, veterans of foreign wars, those sprung up all over the place. For me, I went to boot camp, and then when I left boot camp, I never saw anybody that I'd been in boot camp with ever again. And I went to learn how to do the computer, and with a certain group, and when I finished that training, I never saw any of them again. When I flew to Vietnam, I got in a plane with other Marines, but I didn't know any of them. And when the plane landed, they all went to different places, and I went by myself to join a unit. And then when I came back from Vietnam, I didn't know anybody I was coming back with. So there was only one guy that I sent Christmas cards to for a few years, and that was it. So Vietnam veterans tended not to, I don't know of any Vietnam clubs. I mean, there may be a few, but I don't know of any. So, no. And a lot of Vietnam vets really wanted to be sort of isolated. You all know the Quà Binh Reservoir? After Vietnam, there were a number of Vietnam vets who went off and just lived in the Quà Binh Reservoir, all alone, for years and years and years. Next question.
What are some valuable things like skills or lessons you learned during your time in the military serving in wartime?
Wow. Huh. I didn't learn any skills on a practical level to help me with school or having a job. I mean, learning how to march, learning how to shoot a rifle, learning how to press buttons for aiming a howitzer. Those weren't any skills that helped me. You guys need to go anywhere?
No.
Okay. None of those skills helped me at all.
The following student, please come to the office. William Scott. That's William Scott. Please come to the office.
Wouldn't it be weird if I heard him say my name?
That'd be pretty cool.
One lesson I learned is this, that I'm sort of a normal, okay, natural, nice guy, and I was put in a place where we human beings were doing awful things to each other. And the guy who threw the 2 grenades at me and blew me up, I would love to meet him. Because I bet he was like I bet he had a mom and dad. I bet he maybe had a sister, maybe a girlfriend or a wife, maybe kids. I bet he's sort of like an okay guy, too. And there we were, the two of us, doing things to each other that injured us really for a lifetime. So one thing I've learned...
Following students, please come to the office.
Jim Monroe.
Alyssa and Elena Montes, please come to the office.
So one thing I learned in Vietnam was that, sadly, we human beings are capable of really doing awful things to each other. That was one lesson. And another lesson, well, no, I'll save it for PTSD.
What did you do after the war for a job?
Well, I went back to college, first of all, and did 3 years of college. And then I did 3 years of seminary to study to be an Episcopal priest, and that's what I am now. I'm the pastor of an Episcopal church in Springfield, right next to the Dr. C statues.
Wonderful.
Laura.
Did you stay in touch with any of the troops that you served with after you returned, or attended to any reunions?
And I sort of have already answered that. So no. Mike Owensby was the one guy that I sort of was with a couple of times, and it's 10 years ago that I heard from him. I will say one thing. In Vietnam, on the night we were blown up, another guy was wounded with me. His name was Willie Roe Yates, and he was a good old Southern boy, Willie Roe. He refers to his wife as Miss Mabel. And Willie Roe Yates, sort of a good old boy, and he calls me up once a year on the anniversary of when we got blown up. And so I remember him as this tall, lanky, blonde, skinny kid from the south of the D-backs, and he said he now weighs about 300 pounds. But basically, no.
I get the long one.
Right.
All right. There's a lot on news about the emotional wound of PTSD and how it has affected troops coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. If you feel comfortable telling us, were you or any other military personnel you know who served in Vietnam affected by PTSD, and what are a few ways it affected you? What are some of the ways veterans can cope with and heal emotional wounds like PTSD?
Wow. I see this as the core question of all of these questions. I don't know anybody who served in Vietnam and fought in combat who didn't come home with some level or some form of post-traumatic stress disorder. I think it automatically happens if you're in combat in one way or another. So, when those grenades exploded for me in the foxhole, I learned something. But I didn't know that I'd learned it for years. It took me years to know it. But what I learned in that instant was that that experience was so awful that no matter what else happened in my life, I would make sure that I was safe from something like that happening. So that means that I needed to build some walls to be safe behind so that I wouldn't be vulnerable to being hurt like that. One wall that keeps you safe from being hurt by everything out there that could get to you is taking your own life. So tragically, suicide is a wall that some veterans choose. More Marine Corps and soldiers who fought in Vietnam have come home and taken their own lives than actually died in Vietnam. There are 58,200 names on the wall. I learned how to build a wall. Now the wall I built, it was the wall of being a really nice person, which is a weird wall, but I've learned how to be really, really nice to lots of people, which is good if you're the pastor of a church. But I can do that, but not let any one particular person over the wall to be really close to me. I'm 67 years old, and it was only about 4 years ago, for the first time in my life, I started letting this one particular woman get close enough to me so that she would really know. And it's scary because I could get hurt. So there's a little healing that's going on, like 40 some years later. I'll give you a little example, though, of post-traumatic stress. When I got home from Vietnam, I would get in bed at night, and I would lie in bed, and I would think to myself, maybe right at this moment there's a plane flying over Boston, and it's dropped the atomic bomb. And in 30 seconds it's going to explode. And then what am I going to do? Because the world's going to go crazy, what am I going to do? And so I'd start feeling afraid, lying in bed. And my head would say to me, Jim, there's no plane, there's no bomb, that's stupid. But my logical head wasn't able to have enough strength to go to the place where I was afraid to tell myself to stop being afraid. I knew that it was a crazy thought, but knowing it wasn't enough to stop the fear. So I'd say for 3 or 4 years, every single night I fell asleep with my heart beating fast and being afraid. That's just a tiny little example of post-traumatic stress. And I'll give you one other, there's a million of them, but a friend of mine fought in Iraq. And he came to me a couple years ago with tears pouring down his cheeks, saying that he was afraid that he was going to lose his driver's license. Because what had happened is he'd been in a car in downtown Springfield. There'd been a little bit of a traffic jam, and he roared off with his car fast, and a cop had come after him and pulled him over and gave him a speeding ticket. And he said to me, I'm in trouble. Because he said, I learned in Iraq that any time I was driving a vehicle, military vehicle, and it was really crowded and congested, that was really dangerous and you had to get out of there fast. So, in downtown Springfield, in a traffic jam, his head said to him, there's no danger here. But his head didn't have enough strength to go to the place of him that had been afraid in Iraq and knew that he had to get out of there. So he said, anytime it happens, I'm going to roar off, I'll get a ticket every time, and I'm going to lose my license. What am I going to do? Another little example of post-traumatic stress. We could go on forever, but a couple of little ones.
Have you ever been to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington? Or any other Vietnam Veterans Memorials? If you have, what was it like?
Well, I am thrilled that you 8th graders are going to the wall and that I get to talk with you before you go to the wall. Yes, I've been to the wall many times. It's an amazing place. When it was built, people hated it when it was being built. They thought it looked like a black gash in the ground. They thought it looked like a grave. And they only started liking it when people came to the wall and had an amazing experiences at the wall. I have a friend who fought in Vietnam who has been afraid to go to the wall because he's been afraid that if he went there, all of the stuff that he's tried to keep inside and to hide from would come out. And finally, 2 years ago, he went to the wall for the first time, and it happened. He stood there and he just sobbed as all these things poured out. But he says that that was the first day for the real healing to start inside him. And I brought a painting that I want to show you. And I'll bring it with me in a couple of weeks as well. So, I'll put it maybe where the camera can see it too. So here is a painting of the wall. And you can see that a guy is on his way home from work. He's taken off his jacket, put it over his briefcase, and his hand is touching the wall. And from inside the wall, there's a soldier or Marine reaching up and touching his hand, representing one of the 58,200 names on the wall. And behind him, there are others. And I think it looks sort of like one's white, one's black, one's tan, maybe a woman way in the back, representing everybody who fought in Vietnam.
I've seen that picture before. Isn't this one above the auditorium? I really like that picture.
You know it.
Shows unity.
Uh-huh. Wow.
It's here in our school.
It is. Wow.
I look at it every single time I go to court.
Really?
Every time I go in the auditorium, it's there, and I look up at it.
Wow.
From our Memorial Day Assembly, which we have annually every year, we've historically put that above the auditorium doors for our veterans to see as they come in for the assembly.
Wow. Wow. I take this with me everywhere I go and give talks. That's so cool.
I've always wondered what it meant.
Hmm?
I always look at it, I'm just like, what does it mean?
Yeah. What's actually happening at this moment for this man is some healing. I mean, at the moment, these tears are full of pain. That may be a friend of his who's dead, but in fact, there's healing happening as the stuff inside him is getting out. I mean, you all know this. If you have just a good cry about something, and afterwards nothing's changed, but you feel some better. Pain shared is pain halved, is the old quotation. So, and as we were talking, people do indeed come to the wall and leave all sorts of things, and you'll see some things at the base of the wall when you get there. So, it's an amazing place. You know, here in New England, you go to a little New England village, and there might be a green in the middle and this statue of some guy on a horse. You know, and you don't see people coming to the statue and crying and having experiences. The fact that the names are there, making it real people. And I think maybe what I'll do, when I'm here with you guys in a couple of weeks, is I'll give you the name of the guy beside me in the foxhole who was killed. And I know the panel he was on, and you can maybe go and find that name and know that if those grenades had been slightly different, that's where my name would have been. Any other more questions?
Yeah, there's one more.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you would like to talk about that we have not covered?
Well, maybe not right now, but one interesting thing would be for me to ask you guys, what movies, war movies, have you seen, and do you think they're realistic or not? You got a war movie?
Forrest Gump.
Forrest Gump. Do you think it was realistic or not?
I think it was a little bit realistic because.
Okay, I thought it was a great movie, but I don't think the part about Vietnam was realistic, but for one specific reason that I'll tell you in a minute.
I did see a movie I forgot what it was called, but some of it kind of looked real, but some of it kind of didn't.
Okay.
But I have a relative that he goes to war and he fixes like the trucks and all that, and he also fills in some.
If you think of the name of the movie, let me know. Yeah.
I don't know, like, I can't recall any movies, but I've seen them before, and they're probably not true because they're not showing the soldier, like, they're just showing the wars and the battles, and they're not showing the emotional, like, toll it takes on the soldier, like, in war.
Yeah, okay.
I didn't see a movie about the war, but Mrs. Wood showed us sort of like a movie about how like the wall was made. Like how like people didn't want it there, they felt it was wrong.
Yeah.
But this veteran that came back was like, we need to have this here because these people fought for our country and they deserve to have their names shown. I don't know if it's accurate, but the message was right.
Okay. Wow. The reason, one reason that I said that I don't think it's realistic is because in the movie Forrest Gump, in the Vietnam section, as well as other sections, there's music. And I'm going to say that anytime you see a war movie and there's music, it may be a fantastic movie, but it's telling you a lie about what it was like. Because when I was in Vietnam, there was no orchestra behind a tree line doing background music. And music creates a mood. And it may be telling you that there's a certain mood you're feeling because of the music that would not be accurate to what it was actually like at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, like the movie that I saw, there was no music.
Okay.
Like, they fought only in some parts, but that was probably like only the parts when they were like honoring the people who died, but there wasn't any music.
There was a famous movie about World War II called Saving Private Ryan. Has no music in it at all, zero, and it's very powerful. A movie about Vietnam that has no music is called Full Metal Jacket. Except at the end. Full Metal Jacket is about, the first half of the movie is about Paris Island boot camp. And it's actually realistic because the guy who plays the drill instructor in the movie was a drill instructor in real life. But the second half of the movie is about one battle in South Vietnam. And at the end of the movie, the battle is over, and some Marines are walking across the battlefield. And there's some bodies around and the fighting is over. And there's been no music, but then they start to sing. And as the credits roll at the end of the movie, they're singing a song. Anybody know what song they're singing?
Taps.
Want me to sing it for you?
Sure.
M-I-C-K-Y-M-O-U-S-E. The theme song to the Mickey Mouse Club. And that's their statement of the significance of the battle that they've just fought. And it's really, I mean, it's very heavy duty that they're saying we fought this war, there's bodies here, it's been just absolutely horrible, and what does it amount to? So it's amazing ending. Anyway, that's it. It's a very heavy duty movie. But, so next time you see a war movie, so another one is Platoon. That was a famous movie about Vietnam. A great movie, but loaded with music. So, anyway, that would be another.
What about Forrest Gump? Like, what else is fake, do you think? Like, I thought it was like pretty real to me.
It was very realistic. Where he's running through the woods
Yeah.
during Vietnam, that actually, I didn't know any woods that looked like that in Vietnam. I think that was filmed in California.
But what about, did it rain a while ago?
Yeah, that's true. Yes, that is true.
Well, that's it.
Thank you all.
for coming
Very much.
today.
Well, I'm
It's really nice
I'm
to
glad
meet
to
you.
be here. Yeah, good questions, you guys.
wonderful.
Thank you very much.